My grandson asked the question on a quiet Sunday afternoon when the air was still and the house felt settled. The kind of afternoon that makes you believe nothing important is about to happen. We were sitting on the back porch where the paint was starting to peel and the old wooden bench creaked every time either of us shifted, and he was swinging his legs absent-mindedly while unwrapping an ice pop, the red kind that stained his fingers and left sticky trails wherever he touched. And without looking up at me, he said, "Grandpa, why does Dad call you the bank?" And at first I smiled automatically, because adults often laugh when children say something unexpected. We laugh to soften it, to move past it, to avoid sitting with whatever it stirs up. But the smile didn't settle in my chest the way it usually did. It hovered there awkwardly, unfinished, because the way he asked it wasn't playful. It was curious, innocent, observational, like he was trying to understand a rule of the world that everyone else seemed to already know. And I asked him what he meant, keeping my voice light, and he shrugged and said, "When Dad's on the phone and needs money, he says he's calling the bank. Then Mom rolls her eyes and he says your name." And then he bit into the ice pop like nothing significant had been said, red juice dripping onto the porch boards, and I felt something inside me tilt, not snap, not break, just tilt, like a picture frame that's been crooked for years suddenly catching your eye. And in that moment, memories I had carefully filed away as normal, generous, loving choices started to resurface with uncomfortable clarity. The first time my son asked for help years ago when his business failed, and I didn't hesitate because fathers don't hesitate when their children are hurting. The second time when the business struggled again and I told myself the economy was unpredictable. The third time when he said things would turn around soon and I wanted to believe him, because believing your child is easier than accepting they're stuck. The steady monthly transfers that started as temporary support and slowly became routine. The emergency payments that always seemed urgent and justified in the moment. The loan I never asked to be repaid because keeping the peace felt more important than accountability. The way I never framed any of it as sacrifice because sacrifice feels smaller when you call it love. And as my grandson ran inside, leaving his half-finished ice pop melting on the porch rail, I stayed where I was long after the sun began to dip, listening to the house settle around me, replaying his words over and over. The bank, not Grandpa, not Dad, not family. The bank, a place you go to withdraw from without wondering how it stays standing. And once that thought lodged itself in my mind, it started connecting dots I had spent years deliberately not connecting. The way my son rarely called just to talk anymore. The way conversations always drifted toward money even when they didn't start there. The way thank you slowly faded into expectation. The way my daughter-in-law spoke about finances as something external that arrived rather than something built. The way I felt a flicker of anxiety every time my phone rang near the end of the month. The way I had stopped sharing my own struggles because they felt irrelevant compared to theirs. And that night when I went to bed, I didn't sleep. Not because I was angry, but because I was finally paying attention. And the next morning I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my banking app and scrolled back further than I ever had before. Not just weeks or months, but years. Line after line of transfers that blurred together once I stopped remembering the individual stories attached to them, and I added them up slowly, carefully, afraid of what the total might represent. And when I reached the end, my hands trembled, not because I couldn't afford it, but because of what it said about the shape my role had taken in my son's life, because somewhere along the way my support had stopped being a bridge and become a crutch, and I realized with a quiet kind of horror that I had helped build a version of him who didn't know how to stand without leaning, and worse, a version of my grandson who was learning that responsibility could be outsourced. And I thought about my own father, about how he helped me when I needed it, but never in a way that removed the consequence of my choices. How he taught me that support wasn't the same as rescue, and how I had drifted so far from that lesson without ever consciously choosing to. And that afternoon when my son called, his name lighting up my phone like it always did, I answered as usual but listened differently. And as he explained another situation, another expense that couldn't wait, another reason this month was particularly tight, I noticed the rhythm of it, how naturally the story flowed toward the expectation of help. And when he finished, he waited, comfortable, confident, And instead of responding the way I always had, I asked him a question that felt foreign even to my own ears. I asked him what his plan was, and there was a pause on the line that told me everything. Not the pause of someone thinking, but the pause of someone recalibrating. And he laughed lightly and said, "Dad, you know how things are right now." And that sentence hit me harder than any accusation ever could because it assumed permanence. It assumed my role as solution rather than support. And I told him I needed time to think, which confused him more than a refusal would have. And after we hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at nothing, feeling the slow realization settle in that I had been avoiding a reckoning for years because it was easier to pay than to confront. Easier to transfer money than to risk tension, easier to be needed than to be respected, and over the next week I paid attention to things I had previously brushed aside. How my daughter-in-law talked about upcoming expenses with the certainty that they would be covered. How my son talked about future plans without mentioning how they would be funded. How my grandson casually repeated phrases he didn't understand but absorbed all the same. And I realized that my generosity wasn't neutral anymore. It was shaping behavior, teaching lessons I never intended to teach. And that realization hurt more than any financial loss because it meant love had quietly slipped into enablement. And one evening, as I watched my grandson struggle with a school project, frustrated because he wanted it done quickly, I felt the urge to step in and finish it for him. And I stopped myself, seeing suddenly how closely that impulse mirrored everything else. And that was when I made the decision, not angrily, not dramatically, but firmly, that the next time my son asked for money, the answer would change, not to punish him, not to control him, but to restore something that had been lost between us. Because love without boundaries doesn't stay love forever. It becomes expectation, and expectation corrodes respect. And I wasn't willing to let my grandson grow up believing that the people who love him most exist to absorb his consequences, even if standing firm meant being misunderstood for a while. When the moment finally came, it arrived quietly, without warning. On an ordinary Tuesday evening while I was standing in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup I probably didn't need to be making because I wasn't really hungry. And my phone lit up with my son's name the way it had countless times before. And before I answered, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. The reflex that comes from years of knowing what's coming next. And when I picked up his voice carried that practiced mix of strain and optimism. The tone of someone who has learned that sounding overwhelmed but hopeful makes the ask feel reasonable. And he explained another problem, another unexpected expense, another reason this month was harder than the last. And as he spoke, I noticed how automatic it all felt, how little space there was for uncertainty in his expectation. And when he finished, he paused, not anxiously, not humbly, but confidently, because silence on my end had always meant yes. And I took a breath and told him calmly that I wasn't going to send money anymore. Not this month, not as a standing solution, not in the way we had been doing, and the silence that followed wasn't confusion at first, but disbelief. The kind that assumes the words must have been misunderstood, and he laughed and said I must be joking. And when I didn't laugh back, his voice sharpened slightly, and he asked if I was feeling okay. And that question, meant to sound caring, revealed something painful because concern only surfaced when my usefulness was in question, and I told him I was fine, that I had thought carefully about it, that I loved him, but that I was done being his safety net. And his tone shifted then, irritation bleeding through the humor, and he reminded me of all the times he'd struggled, all the pressure he was under, all the reasons this wasn't fair. And I listened without interrupting because this was the first time I'd truly let him say everything without rescuing him at the end. And when he finished, I told him the truth, that his son had asked why he called me the bank, and the pause that followed was long and heavy, the kind of pause that tells you something has landed exactly where it hurts. And he tried to brush it off, said kids repeat things, said it was just a joke. But I didn't let him escape it. I told him it wasn't a joke to me, that it meant my role in his life had shifted into something transactional, and that I had allowed it for too long. And when he accused me of abandoning him, of choosing a strange moment to suddenly draw lines, I told him something he wasn't prepared to hear, that boundaries don't mean abandonment, they mean responsibility. and that I trusted him enough to let him struggle. And that word struggle seemed to hit him harder than no ever could, because struggle feels like rejection when you're used to rescue. And he raised his voice then, said things he probably didn't mean, and eventually hung up on me. Something he hadn't done since he was a teenager, and when the line went dead, I stood there in the quiet kitchen feeling the old instincts surge up immediately, the urge to call back, to smooth it over, to fix what I had just broken, because fixing had been my role for so long that it felt dangerous to stop, and for the next few days my phone stayed silent, and that silence was worse than any argument because it gave doubt room to grow, room for guilt to whisper that maybe I had gone too far, maybe this was cruel, maybe I was being stubborn instead of loving, and I won't pretend I didn't almost give in, because years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. But then my grandson came over that weekend, and he asked if I wanted to help him build a model airplane he'd been struggling with, and we sat at the table fitting small plastic pieces together, and he grew frustrated when the wings wouldn't align properly, and my instinct was to take it from his hands and do it myself the way I always had with money, to solve the problem quickly so he wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable. And I stopped myself, guiding him instead, letting him try again, letting him fail safely. And when it finally clicked into place, his smile was different from the smiles I'd seen before. It wasn't relief, it was pride. And in that moment I understood something with absolute clarity, that the lesson I needed to teach my son was the same lesson my grandson needed to learn, that support doesn't mean substitution, and love doesn't mean removing every obstacle. And a week later, my son called, again, not to ask for money, but to tell me he was angry, really angry and scared and overwhelmed, and I let him be all of that without interrupting, without offering solutions. And something shifted in that conversation too, because anger spoken honestly has less power than anger cushioned by money. And the weeks that followed were uncomfortable in ways we weren't used to. Family dinners felt tense. My daughter-in-law looked at me with a mixture of resentment and confusion, as if I had taken something from them. And there were nights I lay awake questioning myself, replaying every decision, wondering if I had mistaken firmness for wisdom. But slowly, very slowly, things began to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, almost invisible ways. My son started talking about budgets instead of bailouts, about cutting back instead of covering gaps, about choices instead of emergencies. And one evening he mentioned turning something down because it didn't make sense financially, and I felt a surge of pride deeper than anything I'd ever felt while writing checks, because it meant he was thinking differently. And my grandson stopped using the word bank altogether, started talking about his dad figuring things out, fixing things, handling problems. And one afternoon as we sat together, he said, "Dad says you taught him how to handle stuff." And that sentence undid me in a way no accusation ever could, because stopping the money hadn't ended my role as a father. It had restored it. And months later, when my son finally thanked me, not for the money I used to send, but for trusting him enough to stop, I knew that the question my grandson had asked on that porch hadn't just changed one decision. It had changed the direction of our family, because once you stop being the bank, you stop being a transaction, and you become something far more valuable again. A father who is respected, a grandfather who is listened to, and a foundation that teaches strength instead of replacing it. And I learned something too through all of this, that generosity without limits feels noble but often delays growth, that peace bought with self-erasure never lasts, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is endure being misunderstood while someone else learns how to stand on their own. Because love that protects dignity on both sides is the kind that survives long after the money stops flowing.